All right, so I think, so I obviously watched the videos that you sent me over, so we're looking to improve on some of the leash walking skills with your dog, obviously. So overall, why don't you start with just give me kind of a description of some of the things you've done so far, if you've done any sort of professional training in the past, what some of your big goals are, stuff like that. Now, let me ask you this. When you, so now that you've suppressed it from the total freak out at the door to like just like a growl, if you tell her no for that growl out the window, do you still give a correction for it after that? Or do you just tell her no and that's kind of it? Well, the pet corrector, that would be your correction in that moment, right? Okay, that's all right. So these are a lot of, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Yep. Sure. Which is good, right? So here's the thing. So this is a lot of what I like to get done in these kind of, in these sessions that I do, these virtual sessions, because most of this kind of stuff are with people like you who have done a decent amount of training up to this point. They have a decent understanding of how to apply some of this kind of stuff, and we're just looking to fine tune things, right? So you've found a lot of success with your pet corrector in suppressing that reactivity out the window, which is incredible, right? Like that's something that takes people a lot of time typically to accomplish. And like you said, you've struggled with it for X amount of time so far, and we're now getting some headway on it. And a lot of people then will hit a point where they'll do what you're doing now, where their no marker starts to become charged, right? It gets some value behind it, right? So when we use it in those moments, once the behavior is instead of over here, it's down here, we'll just say no, and if the dog stops, we don't apply the correction for it, right? Which is understandable because it's better than what it was, but it's still the wrong mentality, because here's the thing, we want to totally eliminate that reactivity. And even though it's went from the total freak out to like I'm staring out and I'm concerned and I'm growling, we want to do away with that last little bit. We don't want to have to say no every time the mailman comes to get her to stop doing the behavior. We want her to just stop doing the behavior, right? So one big black and white rule that we have when it comes to applying a punisher, right? A punisher could be anything. It could be your pet corrector, it could be a pop on your leash, it could be an e-collar correction, it could be any of the above, anything the dog perceives as aversive, right? But anytime we say no for something, we always have to apply that punisher, because the no marker is not the correction. The no marker is simply what attaches the correction to the behavior. And utilizing your pet corrector, for example, let's say, let's say this is my pet corrector here and I have it across the room, right? And, you know, she starts growling out the window at somebody, whatever, right? You could mark with no in that moment, and I fully expect that she's gonna stop when I say no, because she's like, oh shit, like I know what typically comes after this, right? And then you would go, and because you've identified the mistake and essentially taken a picture of that behavior she was doing in that moment, you bought yourself the time to go get your pet corrector, go up to her, give your correction with it, and she'll understand that that correction, even if she's nowhere near the window at that point, is for whatever she was doing when she heard no. And that's essentially how we finish that behavior off, right? That's how we fully suppress the behavior. Then at that point, you would redirect her onto something else if you wanted to. Then at that point, that's where we would start then reinforcing the proper behavior. But what I want to start seeing is I want to start seeing that the mailman comes, we don't have a reaction, we don't have a growl, we don't have anything. Then I would start adding positive reinforcement in at that point for the lack of response, right? For the full correct behavior, right? Because if you don't finish, go ahead. Exactly. It is exactly the same as yes, it's exactly the same as click, it's whatever, right? All it does is attach the reinforcement to the behavior, right? So that's one big thing that we'll see a lot of people will make the mistake of. Once they get things like 80% of the way there, they kind of slide off and they don't finish it off the rest of the way like that because it's so much better, you know? And what happens is it's a slippery slope. Well, then it kind of slowly starts sliding back to what it was before because the behavior is still there, just in a more minor scale of it, you know? So that's one thing right off the rip that I would do. But that's fantastic. And then again, you know, at that point, you know, once the behavior is gone, then add all the reinforcement we want. Then what the force-free trainers and stuff say of, you know, counter condition and create a more positive association, stuff like that, that's when that comes into play with things. And that's really the missing link with things is we eliminate the behavior, we inhibit the behavior, then we create the positive association after that. So that's one thing right off the rip you could apply obviously in the house. And same deal would apply for any other nuisance behaviors. Like if you're having any issues with, I don't know, jumping, counter surfing, things like that. As long as you identify that behavior, she doesn't have to be doing the behavior when she actually gets the correction, right? Because you've already taken your snapshot of it at that point. So that's one thing off the rip. So other question here, we'll obviously get into your 3 things, but how is your dog's food drive? Is it pretty good? Oh, great. That's wonderful. So that obviously helps quite a bit. Obviously, you don't necessarily need it, but like it's, you know, there is definitely a lot of benefits to using positive reinforcement with this kind of stuff. So that's great. Okay, cool. Yeah. Yep. Good. That's awesome. Yeah. No, that's phenomenal. Okay, cool. Getting into some of these things, obviously we'll get into the leash reactivity stuff, and that will kind of encompass all of the videos you sent me and everything. We'll talk about all of that and how to kind of fix some of the issues you're having with your prong, how to implement your e-collar into things and stuff. But you had mentioned place, right? You had some questions about place, stuff like that you wanted to address. Let's get into that here first. Yep. Understood. Okay. Well, so here's the thing. When it comes to our commands, their behavior or their compliance is contingent on a reinforcement they care enough about, right? That could be them really wanting the thing that we have for them or wanting to avoid the thing that for not doing it. You know what I mean? So obviously with any of these different commands, we have to go through the process of teaching the command first. And typically that would be the process of the way I've always done it is through leash and positive reinforcement, right? So I shape it with the leash, what's expected. I reinforce when they do it correctly, right? And I start off with my expectation, just does my dog have like basically a 100% understanding of when I say this command, it means to go to this spot, right? And I keep it easy initially, even though like when things are quiet and stuff like that, like even when I have guests come over the house, my dogs will go to it from pretty much anywhere in the room. When there's higher distractions present, I kind of shrink my criteria down to like maybe within like 5 feet of the bed. So like I'll put myself like within 5 feet of that bed, I'll give my command for it and make sure that they go from that distance. So in your training sessions, I would be training for the picture of what you're going to use in those high distracting situations. So a lot of people make the mistake of, because the dog in a low distracting environment, because they're motivated, they'll go from 10 feet away, 15 feet away, stuff like that. They spend too much time practicing the distance as opposed to the duration, right? So make it as easy as possible for the next couple of weeks here as far as work that command from like 4 feet away from the bed, right? Make sure she's rock solid with when you get like 4 feet next to that bed that she's basically flying onto it on her own, right? We kind of want to see when we go near it that autopilot of before we even say bed or before we even say place that she's just gunning for it, right? So get... Mm-hmm. Sure. Yep, and that's what we want to see. Yep, so are you using that mat still, or are you using a different bed now? Okay. I gotcha. Yes. So that... Yes. Yeah, so that mentality is fine post-training, right? Like post we've taught and proofed this command. That would be generalization, right? So we would generalize it to this rug on the ground over here, this bed over here, this ottoman over here, et cetera, et cetera. But in the early teaching stages, you got to pick one thing for it so that she, you know, because if you're doing like different things like every time for it, she's never going to be able to really predict it and do it really, really successfully with a lot of intensity, you know? So that's going to be the first thing you got to do is you got to just pick one thing for it. And usually I recommend, you know, because the situations you're going to be using it are guests coming over, workers over, things like this, something that's going to be in the immediate living area, obviously, is most ideal for that. So pick one really clear visual spot for the dog, right? It could be whatever sort of dog bed or anything you want, or again, some people will use like an ottoman or something like that, but make sure it's one thing to start here. And you want to see in the house right now that same intensity you saw with the mat towards whatever this object is going to be, right? And that's your number one goal before you're even worried about like she needs to hold this for 30 minutes, she needs to hold this around a ton of distractions and stuff. I want to see like rock solid 100% drive to go to that object, right? Or that item, right? If you want to. That's your choice. If you want to use that, you can. If you want to have something that's going to be in your house all the time, that's fine as well. That's totally up to you at that point. So, but it's got to be the same thing in the same spot every time to start, right? From there, once you have that intensity of going to it, then we make sure we just teach our duration around minimal distractions, right? So I usually have like a 2-step process for this where I'll put the dog onto it, right? I will kind of have them on a leash typically in this stage. That way, in case they didn't get on for whatever reason, I can help them onto the position. And I'll kind of arc around the bed holding the leash to start, right? And usually what I do is I add 2 rewards in at this point. So my initial reward when the dog gets onto the position, right? And to clarify, I don't know how you use markers and rewards right now. For this kind of stuff, I use what I refer to as a bridge marker, right? Which means that it's a duration marker. So when the dog gets onto the bed, I tell them good, and it does not mean they can get off of the bed. They have to hold the position while I bring the reward to them, right? The other marker would be like yes or click, which we would call a terminal marker, which means the dog can come out of position to get the reward, right? So we use bridge markers for this. You're gonna be using that for it. The dog needs to be in place to get that reward. So my first reward is when the dog gets onto the bed, right? For getting onto the bed, obviously. My second reward is for the duration. So I would get the dog onto the bed, walk up to it, say place or bed or whatever command you want to use for it. Once the dog gets in position, tell them good, give your reward for that. From there, you would start walking around the bed holding the leash, right? And if the dog gets off, tell them no, help them back on, try again. Do that until the dog can hold it while you're walking around holding the leash. Then you would mark with good and reward again for that, right? So the first reward is for getting onto the command. The second reward is for holding the command, so the duration, right? Once that looks rock solid, where I could pretty consistently get the dog onto the bed, have them hold it while I walk around, then I would start adding in dropping the leash and walking away. So I'd put them on the bed, I would set my leash down on the ground, I would walk around the room, and at this point we're not shooting for, again, crazy amounts of duration. We're shooting for distance that I can get away from the dog and come back to them. So really what I would do is I would put them on, drop my leash, walk to the other side of the room, walk right back, right? So just really short amount of time. I just want them understanding when I put you here, if I walk away, it's still expected that you stay there, right? Same concept. If the dog broke command when I was away from them, I would tell them no, grab their leash, just go put them back onto it, try again. And at this point, no big corrections or anything for it. The no marker or the correction for this would be our negative punishment, so the withholding of the reward. So they just realize like you're not going to get the reward unless you're on the thing, right? Once a dog held it, same deal. I would go back to them, get my leash, reward for my duration, and release them off, right? So I need to make sure that I could. Not yet. We're gonna get there, right? So initial step here before we worry about duration with it is we have to teach the command and teach the duration, which, listen, you may have done a ton of this before and this whole process may take you 1 day to do. You know what I mean? This might be a very short process, but we gotta check the box that the dog clearly understands the command and clearly understands that the command means to stay there until I release you, right? So, at that point, once we've gotten all 3 of those steps down, so the step of just getting onto the command, then just getting into the command with duration holding the leash, then just getting into the command, dropping the leash and walking away, then we're ready to start proofing it. Then we start adding first our duration into it around minimal distractions. So that's where I would tell people, you're gonna have your dog hold a 20-minute bed stay. Like you're gonna jump right into it with a lot of duration, and that's where we would start giving more of a correction for breaking the command. Now, that correction could be an e-collar correction. That correction could be just a leash pop, right? That's going to be kind of up to you how you want to do it. I would probably say to start, I would just do a leash pop because we're going to be adding the e-collar into the walk here first. That's going to be the first place I want to do it. And I don't like doing a lot of different things with the e-collar all at once, you know? So same concept, you would put the dog into position, you would drop your leash, they would be on their leash and prong at this point, right? And walk away and hang out. And anytime your dog gets up, you would mark with no, you would go over, grab your leash and give a fairly firm leash pop, right? You want it to be, you know, aversive enough where it deters the behavior, obviously. After you give your leash pop, just help them right back into command, right? And you would repeat that process until your dog was able to hold that position, right? For 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, et cetera, right? Now, at this point, I still don't really have the expectation of it being reliable around high level distractions, right? That's kind of the last stepping stone of it. But first thing we need to get is, like you were saying, we need to get the duration. We need to get the dog understanding when you're put on this, there's a potential you're gonna be there for a while, right? So leash pop first for that. This is all going to be done on your leash and prong, and you're still going to be incorporating your food into it. You can still reward at the beginning of the command and for the duration if you want to, but the key is we're starting to add in a consequence for not holding the command, right? And our next stepping stone after we've achieved that first, like the 3 steps of making sure the dog understands the position, our second stepping stone is we want to, around minimal distractions, be able to have the dog hold the position for roughly 20, 25, 30 minutes, somewhere around there, right? Again, anytime they broke it, fairly firm leash pop, and then just take them back to the bed. Repeat that drill until you can get that. Third and last big step of this would be proofing it around like high level distractions. And that's typically where you're gonna need your e-collar for it. And again, we're gonna get into the whole process of using the e-collar and stuff here in a minute, but that really is where that comes into play, because a lot of times for the average dog owner, being able to be dynamic enough with the leash and the prong collar and really give like motivating enough corrections and stuff with it, it's very challenging to do. And frankly, some dogs aren't motivated enough by it to be able to get a motivating enough correction to get through that. Where the e-collar is pretty black and white. It's really adjustable. It's very easy for you to adjust the intensity up and down with to match that level of distraction, you know? And what that will probably look like, and again, I don't really, like I said, we're going to do one more of these sometime next week. I don't really anticipate you're going to use your e-collar with your place command for in between now and then. That will be something you'll probably implement afterwards, right? But it would be the same process where we would put the dog into position. If they didn't do it, we would give a fairly high level correction for that, and then we would help them back into position. And same deal, just repeat that process until they were able to successfully hold it. Right? So that's kind of in a nutshell, like the dumbed down way of teaching place, right? There's a bunch of different ways you could do it. Like, you know, if I were doing it like in the training session and I had total control over things, there probably would be a couple additional steps I would go through and stuff like that. But that whole process will work for you at home as far as being able to get a pretty reliable place command. But the big thing is, I always tell everybody, you want to stay in the training stages and the teaching stages as long as you can, right? Because here's the thing, the better understanding of the command the dog has and the better understanding of the duration that the dog has, the easier it's going to be to proof and enforce later, right? Where if you rush through those training stages and the dog isn't like 100% solid on stuff, and then we start adding big corrections into things, you run a little bit more of a chance of confusing them and having some kind of places you need to kind of, you know, finagle things and stuff. So you're not going to ruin them by any means, but make sure that those first 3 steps that you have are like really good before you go to move on from that. So that's kind of place command. Do you have any questions on that? Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Cool, perfect. Okay, cool. So moving on to reactivity here. So obviously you have a dog that's very spazzy, right? You have a dog that gets very overstimulated and stuff like that. Is normal. I mean, we'll see that fairly frequently, obviously. And, you know, the fact that you've seen some success with the doorway stuff and everything tells me that the dog can control that impulse fairly well. It's probably not like the most extreme case of reactivity we've ever seen by any means, you know. So really, you know, a couple things I have here from your videos that I was watching is, you know, you were kind of asking with the prong collar, you know, you've been doing it for a couple months. The walk when you're holding the leash pretty short is obviously better, but like it's still pushing ahead, and there's kind of, you know, you're needing to pop a lot and stuff like that. The biggest note I had here from when I was watching those videos was we need to go over kind of just the purpose of the prong collar in general, right? So the prong collar to me is not a tool that I use to necessarily finish the walk. You know what I mean? Like it's like we said, using the place command as an example, it's a very difficult tool to master, you know, and it's a very difficult tool to be dynamic with. So it could be really hard to get a lot of headway with stuff. Now, what we do use it for is we use it for We use it for shaping behaviors, right? So we use it for shaping the general commands that we're gonna be doing. I wanna know that I could physically get a dog into a sit, into a down, onto a bed, into a heel position, et cetera, with it, which you've checked that box already, right? Like when you were showing me that first video you sent me, you were able to physically hold the dog in the heel position, right? Yeah. Well, it's not, right? So yes, you're right. They kind of do go hand in hand. The problem is intense vocalization that's associated with like an aroused behavior can be very subconscious to dogs sometimes, right? Like they know they're doing it, but they know they're reacting, but they're not connecting the dots of like, I'm lunging, I'm barking, I'm whining, like I'm doing all these individual things. It's kind of one big mess to them, you know? And by going in and saying like barking or whining, like I'm just gonna correct the barking at that point. Again, the noise and the noise the dog is making, the arousal is, like I said, it's more of a byproduct of the physical things the dog is doing. So by stopping the physical things, we decrease the arousal levels a little bit, which typically on its own will decrease the barking and stuff. From there, at that point, if you have a dog that's not lunging or not making any forward motion towards another dog, but may just be like whining a little bit or like a little bit excited or something, that's kind of normal. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, and like I said, like that's a little bit normal from the standpoint of she's working through this huge emotional response she used to have towards other dogs, and this stuff almost never is like on a spectrum of, or sorry, it's almost never like a black and white, like dog is reacting and dog is just calm with other dogs. It's typically on a spectrum of like dog is reacting, lunging, pulling, barking, to dog is no longer lunging, pulling, but they're still barking and whining, to then as they do that successfully, the arousal level decreases more and it turns into maybe just whimpering and whining, to then it turns into they're calm and focused on us, you know? So you've gotten some of the way there by addressing all of this stuff, and if you put a little bit more structure to seeing if there's any more forward motion left, you know what I mean? And correct for that, you'll probably see that arousal come down even more. From there, the attention work you'll do with the positive reinforcement for the correct behavior will then shift the rest of the focus onto you, you know? So it's not that it's wrong to correct barking. Like if you're in your house and your dog is demand barking at you or something, like you can correct for that, stop it obviously, right? Out the window or out the door, you can correct for it because you can't see the forward motion, you know what I mean? They go to the barrier and they're stuck behind that barrier and they can't go anymore. So even in that case, my expectation is not necessarily that they don't bark or growl. My expectation more than anything is that they disengage from the barrier, you know what I mean? So I almost want to see, like when you were using your dog as an example of how he's like growling out the window now still, but he's not like lunging and barking. I almost want to see when you correct for that growling that he's just like, you know what, when I'm looking out this window and getting myself all worked up and like looking for trouble, it doesn't get me anywhere, you know, and I want to see them just kind of go and do something else, you know. Like at this point, like we got a bunch of windows and stuff going on outside our house and everything, and our dogs, like they look out them, but you could tell the state of mind is so different. Like they're not looking for something, you know. It's not like they're like, where's the squirrels, where's the deer, where's the stray cats that are back there and stuff. They're just kind of like casually like staring out the window, you know. So you got to obviously distinguish between what your dog is doing in that moment, figure out where you need to correct for it specifically, but that's kind of the expectation more than anything. So again, big picture, it's not that correcting for barking is bad, it's just there's more clear things that we can correct for than the barking that the dog will understand better, you know? So moving into implementing the e-collar for some of this kind of stuff. So your e-collar is obviously a great tool for some of this kind of stuff, but it can be challenging at times to implement on your own unless you really know what you're doing with it, obviously. So we're going to kind of break down some of the key things you're going to want to do with the e-collar and a couple of like the ways that people will typically use them, right? So first off, do you still have like the box and the packaging and everything for that? Okay, perfect. So first thing I want you to do, if you haven't already, is in the box, there's an extra set of contact points that are a little bit longer than the ones that are currently on the e-collar. Put those on right away. So really, unless I have like a ridiculously short-haired dog, I always use the extra long contact points because it allows me to not have the collar quite as tight, and it just gives me more of a chance that I'm going to get a good consistent contact. Because the number one issue that I hear people say when they're trying to implement e-collars on their own is that they can't get consistent contact. They can't tell if the dog is feeling it, and sometimes they're overstimming the dog, sometimes they're understimming the dog, which is inevitable to an extent. Like, that's going to happen sometimes, but it could be sidestepped pretty easily by making sure the tool is fitted up properly on the dog. So long contact points. Obviously, you're going to position it under the prong collar, so prong will be high on the neck, e-collar will go right underneath it, and I'll usually offset the box like right here or right here. Those are just the flattest spots, so it sits pretty nicely there and gets a good contact. And then make sure it's pretty snug. Like, your first couple sessions, you're almost going to want to put it on to the point where it feels like it's too snug, just to ensure you're going to get good contact. From there, before I start actually using it for my training exercises, I try to get a baseline of like what sort of level range my dog will work in. So what I do is, first thing, if I'm going to intro an e-collar to a dog, is I'll start at 0, I'll tap, I'll go up, I'll tap, I'll go up, I'll tap, until I see some sort of visual response out of the dog. Now, I don't get super crazy with this like a lot of trainers do, where they're like, you have to keep it extremely low and it needs to be this really gentle sensation and this and that, because in the end of the day, we're trying to use this tool in a really simple, really effective way that's going to deter behaviors, right? So we don't want it crazy high, but you have to see that the dog cares about it, but isn't necessarily like jumping out of their skin, right? From there, usually what I'll do is I'll incorporate the e-collar when I have people doing it on their own. I'll have them incorporate the e-collar using taps as opposed to holding, right? So obviously, the two different ways to use an e-collar are, you could use either negative reinforcement, where you're holding the button down and using like continuous pressure and teaching the dog like off switches for it, right? Which, you know, if I were going through a full training program with your dog and stuff, we would spend a lot of time doing that at lower levels and conditioning and the sensation and this and that. But it's kind of challenging to do at home because your level range ranges so much when you're doing it, and you need to be very, very precise with it, or else you could actually confuse the dog more than if you were just using taps on the e-collar. So the most basic way that you can incorporate the e-collar into your walking and into the general things that you'll need to use it is by just teaching like a baseline understanding that a tap on the e-collar means to move in your direction, right? So basically what I would do is same process. I would go out into an open area, right? It could be a yard, it could be your driveway, it could be wherever. And I would have the level set at a level where the dog cares about it more than the outside distractions, obviously. And you'd probably have to test that a couple times to see what that's going to be. And what I would do is I would start miscellaneously walking around. And anytime I lost the dog's attention, it would be similar to the 180 drill with the prong collar. You would turn, give a tap on the e-collar, and then say, come, right? And you would repeat this process until the dog's attention is like 100% on you, right? Like, you can't even turn without them turning with you because they're so focused in, right? And the hardest part about this exercise is making sure that your level is set high enough for those distractions, because you're going to see it's going to, especially the first couple times you do this, it's going to fluctuate so much, right? It's going to be like suddenly there's no distractions and you're down at like, I don't know, a 10, a 15, and then there's a squirrel over there and you got to go up to a 50, and then, you know, whatever, a dog's across the street, and then you got to go up to a 70, and then suddenly you got to go back down to a 10, and it's just, it really can be all over the place, and you have to not look at the number so much, and you have to just 100% of the time be dictating it off of how the dog is responding to it, right? And you would do that again until the dog is just moving in your direction and essentially... Yep. Every time, yeah, and you'll the first couple times you do it, it's going to be hard because you're going to be using it a lot, obviously. But as you need to use it less and less, I kind of play a game with myself every single time that I'm working with a dog, where I kind of say, anytime I need to use this e-collar, did the dog care too much about it, too little about it, or just right, you know? And again, what does that look like? It's dog dependent. Obviously, you have to read your dog and be like, was that motivating enough? Was it too motivating, or did it underwhelm him a little bit? And you got to make those adjustments from there. And usually what I'll do is every single time I use it, I'm adjusting up or down in an increment of like 5 to 10, you know? From there, you're going to have the dog's attention on you. You're going to have them walking pretty nice with you. It may be a little annoying initially because a lot of times when you first start this, they kind of glue themselves up to you to try to like stay in your bubble because they're understanding what we want. And sometimes you could like almost find yourself like tripping over them a little bit and stuff. So if you find yourself in that position, don't sweat it too much. As they do it more successfully and don't need as many corrections, that will loosen up a little bit and it won't be quite as annoying, obviously. But you would incorporate that right away into your walking like that. And usually what I recommend is you'd spend about a week working that drill. And you may find that after a session of it, you could go for a walk and maybe you need to change directions with your tap like once or twice, but you hit a point where your walk looks pretty freaking good, right? From there, it should be completely loose, right? So at this stage, the e-collar is doing all of the work, right? The leash is really just there for like a directional component and essentially for safety purposes, but you should be keeping that leash like 100% loose so the dog is able to make the mistake. Because if we're holding it short, the dog can never get far enough ahead of us where they make the mistake and we can never give the correction for it, you know? So 100% loose with it, and you want to be able to walk with that leash total slack J in the leash, you know? And then as you're passing distractions and stuff, the biggest thing is a lot of people will walk too close to the distraction where they need to shorten your leash up too much, and then again, they miss the mistakes. Where we want to stay loose on the leash the whole time, but just create more distance, right? That way you could see, like if I'm walking straight down the sidewalk, right, and another person is coming my way down the sidewalk, right, and I kind of arc around that person, I'm able to see, does the dog stay moving straight, like towards the distraction, or do they arc with me away from it, you know? And if they don't arc with me away from it, that's where same deal, I'd give my e-collar correction for that lack of focus with it. But pretty much all of this when you're doing it should be done with a long leash so the dog is actively making that choice to stay with you, you know? So that's kind of in a nutshell how you would begin to implement the e-collar into some of this. And you said you haven't currently done anything with it so far?
No, other than just introduce her to the collar, that's all I've done.
And when you say introduce it, do you mean just putting it on her, or what do you mean by that? I gotcha. Yeah, and here's the thing, like obviously we want to do some of that stuff to not create like this like crazy aversive association with the collar or anything. Big thing I tell everybody is when we're using new training tools, it's very, very common that initially the dog is not going to like it, right? So I wouldn't be surprised if, you know, your first week that you're using this, you got to take it out. She's like, no, get that thing away from me, you know? But as you get further through your training and you need to use it less and less, you'll start to see that no different than I'm sure the prong collar looks at this point. You get it out and it symbolizes we get to go do fun things, right? Like when I take my e-collars out at this point, my dogs get jacked up because it means we're going to run off leash in the field or we're going for a hike or this or that. So there's not as much aversion associated with it. But even when I started e-collar training with my dogs, like they didn't like the thing. Like they knew it was something that symbolized rules and boundaries and corrections, you know. So that's normal. And, you know, again, like as we're getting into this stuff, a lot of the things we talked about today, they're correction-based things, right? A lot of the problems people are having are not understanding how to successfully implement consequences into their training so the dog learns from them. So you just want to make sure, like as you're adding some of these things in, you're equally adding in an appropriate amount of reinforcement for the correct behavior, you know? Just to help make sure you're not creating too much of a negative association. And then once the dog does start getting it, we could really, like I said, pump them up and be like, yes, this is correct. This is what we want you to do, you know? So.
Am I using any sort of food reward at all while I'm doing this e-collar drill?
Yeah, definitely. So on those tap and turns, right? So let's say you're walking. As soon as you start getting to a point where you can make that turn and the dog turns with you without the need of any sort of correction, that's where you would implement a reward for that. Because that's the goal with it, is we want them understanding when we're moving in one direction, they need to divert and move in that direction with us. So the second they start getting that and doing it on their own without the need of any leash pressure or any e-collar help, we want to start letting them know that that's the correct thing at that point. So, yeah, and especially, like I said, you said your dog's pretty food motivated. Like, if they're really food motivated, it could really expedite this process a lot, and it could counteract a lot of any sort of stress you may see in association with the process, you know? So, what, I mean, I feel like obviously I threw a lot of information at you. What kind of questions can I answer for you about any of that? we did a little bit, but like I said, this first week, I want you going through the steps of making sure they have a really good command of it, and then obviously adding in your leash correction for not holding place first. From there, once that looks good, then we'll add the e-collar into it. But because I only like adding the e-collar into like one thing at a time, you know, and this first week, your e-collar use will be with the walk, and it'll just be like leash, prong, and food for the place command. And then the next one that we do, we'll start adding the e-collar into it then at that point. And you should be able to get a good amount of duration with just the leash and prong. Like I said, adding in those corrections, like dog gets off, no, leash correction, take them back to it. You should be able to get a decent amount of duration just doing that, just not around like high distractions, you know. But you should be able to get 20 minutes on it, like easy. That should be pretty easy to do. What else you got? Yeah. There's a lot of information. Obviously, I'm assuming it looked like you were taking notes most of the time on that? Okay, perfect. If you have any questions on any of it, or you forget something or whatever, just shoot me an email and I'll answer it for you, obviously. But your big homework assignments between now and the next Zoom that we do are, I want you getting the e-collar with the walk looking really good, and I want your place command pretty solidified in the house around minimal distractions. And if those things can look good, we could kind of proof the walk a little bit next time, talk about proofing it and addressing any issues you may have run into with it. And then in addition to that, what was I going to say? And adding the e-collar into the place command then at that point. So, sweet. Hell yeah. Yeah, I mean, you got a lot of work to do, but you're off to a good start with stuff, and like even though it sounded like a lot of stuff, like everything I described is really like, we're talking like a couple training sessions worth of things to do, you know? So like I said, if you're having issues with any of it, or it just doesn't seem like it's clicking or something, do like what you did last time, take a video of it and send it to me. And before our next Zoom call, we'll schedule it. I'll shoot you an email once we get off here. Well, before we do the next one, I'll want to see videos of the progress anyways of where you're at with things, so we could critique those things. So, no problem. If you need anything at all, you know how to get a hold of me, and then we'll kind of go from there.
All right.
All right, Tricia. Yep.